Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Around the Empire podcast is listener-supported independent media. Pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also, please like, share, and subscribe on the YouTube channel. Gareth Porter joins us today. Both in 1918 and in 2020, pandemics forced the U.S. military to make changes in their operations, but the Pentagon has also revealed a resistance to stand down, even when it's necessary to protect the troops. We talk about the similarities and the differences between the situations in 1918, during the Spanish flu pandemic in World War I, and today's coronavirus pandemic, during the never-ending imperial wars. We also talk about the kinds of movements, changes, and consequences that might be catalyzed by this latest crisis. Gareth Porter is an independent investigative historian and journalist on the national security state. He's the author of numerous books, including Perils of Dominance, Imbalance of Power, and the Road to War in Vietnam, and also Manufactured Crisis, The Untold Story of the Iran Nuclear Scare, and he's a co-author with John Kiriakou of his latest book, The CIA Insider's Guide to the Iran Crisis, From CIA Coup to the Brink of War. Gareth is the winner of the 2012 Gellhorn Prize for Journalism. We recorded this on April 10th, 2020. Gareth Porter's here, speaking to us from the Washington, D.C. area. Hello, Gareth. Thanks so much for coming back on the show. I appreciate it.
Good morning, Joanne. Glad to be back with you.
First, I need to ask, how are you doing, and how are things going in Washington? And I don't know, I hear that it's heating up there. I'm in New Jersey. I'm in the southern part of New Jersey, so I'm not really in the New York City metro area, but all the guidelines for New Jersey are based on this sort of consortium that the governors of Connecticut, New York, and New Jersey got together, and they are imposing similar guidelines here. So I'm under a similar lockdown as New York is, but New Jersey is, one of the hot spots. We're the most densely populated state in the nation. I'm in the Philadelphia metro area, however, and it was mentioned in one of the. I try to listen to the state and federal briefings at least a few times a week, and I hear that Washington and Philadelphia are both heating up. But I was just wondering, just you okay? You and your family, how are things going?
Well, not only am I okay, and my wife is okay, but I think I ought to feel a little bit guilty because my lifestyle is such that, having been confined to my home and being able to work on the stuff that I normally work on even more intensively is much less of a burden than it is for most people. So I guess that's the way I look at it at this point. I have plenty of time more time than I normally would have to do what I really need to do and what I want to do.
Yeah, thank God this didn't happen when we were younger, and we didn't have all these online resources. And
right.
I can imagine, or when my kids were little, I feel bad for people in my neighborhood. They've got little kids, and I could just, imagine trying to.
No. This is a terrible burden for so many people. And that's really why I say what I did say, that I feel somewhat guilty because it's so little a problem, relatively speaking, for me.
Yeah, it's not a stark change.
Yeah.
Are you working on a new book too? I can't remember whether
I actually
just published one. Yeah.
I have. Yes, I finished a short book with John Kiriakou, which I think we may have alluded to at our previous time together. And now I am beginning to put together the thinking that is required to work on a new book on the nature of the war system, the essence of the war system, how it works, and how it has bamboozled, deceived the American public for so many decades, and really trying to reveal the inner workings of the system. I think it's going to be the most important thing that I've actually worked on when I'm finished.
Yeah. Yeah, those big, you're really good at those. Well, you're good at several different kinds of investigative research, but the big picture, you're really good at the big picture stuff, which I think you can get to more people with big picture um, messages and information. Like I try to keep, we go into the weeds in this podcast with various experts and all, but I try to keep it at a level for people who are exploring this
Yeah,
topic
yeah,
because that's me. And
yeah.
for the past 10 years, I was, full blown propagandized for maybe not 10 years, maybe 15 years ago.
Mhm.
And I had little kids and I had a full-time job and did not have the time to understand what was going on because there's a lot of information out there in plain sight. It's just that you have to do a lot of work to get to it, and there are so many people who are feeding you the official narrative that it's hard. There were voices, for example, after 9/11 and in the lead up to the Iraq War. I was not at all plugged in. I didn't know about antiwar.com.
Mhm.
My only alternative media was starting to go overseas because at the time the Guardian was pretty good. And I thought, can I get some information that's not just feeding me the same thing over and over again? So it took me a while to get plugged into, um, alternative media and to do the research to understand who I did trust and who I didn't.
Well,
So,
actually, I think the difference between you and me in this regard is not really very great at all. I think that your story would parallel mine to a significant degree, even though I had done work on Vietnam, of course, and had finished my book on Vietnam and how we got involved in the war, why we got involved in the war, and it opened my eyes to truths that I had not understood before. And then I really, and of course, it coincided with the Iraq invasion and occupation, and that combination really got me started on the quest for the kind of information and analysis that you're talking about. So, I really embarked on a very similar a similar exploration as you did around the same time in around 2004, 2005.
yeah, yeah, I think quite a lot of people woke up around that time. And the other thing is it takes a lot of time to do the research and to
Right.
find the people that you need, but it's also it it is a painful shift in your worldview, and I think it just naturally takes time psychologically to accept it. Not only to learn it but to accept it, because I would go through phases where I learn something and then I'd step away from it because it was
Mm.
just too much.
Very
So
interesting. Yeah, I can see
that,
why that could happen, definitely.
yeah, I mean it shatters your. My dad was a World War II veteran, and we were you know, red, white, and blue all the way. And I still am. I mean, I still love this country. I don't hate military or anything. I understand now where the roots of the problems are, and it's not among the citizens really. It's as with most countries, it's with the leadership and with a
Yeah.
higher level, and we could see that today. But we'll look forward to that new book, and maybe just mention real quick your new book, just so people are aware of it. I think they probably are, but make sure they know where to get it.
Right. This is the book that I did with John Kiriakou, and it's called The CIA Insider's Guide to the Iran Crisis. Lest we forget that there has been and still is an Iran crisis, even though it may be in abeyance in relative terms at this moment for obvious reasons. And it was published in February and is available, of course, on Amazon.com. And it's a small book. It's an easy read. It's a quick read, and tries to get across the some of the aspects of this crisis and how it happened, how where it came from. That I think your listeners may be unfamiliar with the history of just how the United States turned Iran into such a crucial antagonist or a crucial enemy of the U.S. military-industrial congressional complex, and why they did it. So this really tries to answer those sorts of questions.
Yeah, I've been meaning to set something up. We're going to have to do an interview on that book too after this. I've got
Yes.
a couple in my stack, but that's definitely one of the ones I want to read. So we'll have to follow up on that. And but today, what we're going to talk about is an article that Gareth wrote recently in the American Conservative, and it's titled How Generals Fueled the 1918 Flu Pandemic to Win Their World War. And I just want to mention that I have a personal contact to this 1918 flu pandemic because, according to what I've been told by my family, my mother's mother, so my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, her mother, she grew up without a mother pretty much. She was a child during this pandemic, and her mother died from this flu.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't really know very much about it, but it was because of your article and other things I dug into. The Philadelphia was hit really hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so all of my family, both parent sides, born and raised in Philadelphia. So they lived in the city, though out on the sort of the higher numbered streets. And so yeah, it's it has a personal there's a personal toll for me too. So I'm particularly interested in this subject.
Well,
And
can I just mention something about Philadelphia that you may be particularly interested in and may not be aware of? I don't know if you've encountered this in your reading, but Philadelphia, as you say, was extremely hard hit. And the primary reason that it happened the way it did in Philadelphia is that there was a major parade in September of 1918, of
yeah,
course, that was for the purpose of selling Liberty bonds,
yeah,
Liberty loans. And this was like one of those things that was regarded as a patriotic duty. And the government put lots of pressure on people to purchase these Liberty loans, these bonds, um, to support the war effort. And so there was a major parade that was scheduled despite the fact that the pandemic, the 1918 influenza pandemic had already hit very hard in Philadelphia. It was beginning to spread rapidly. And the people, the city fathers there knew it, but they felt under pressure from the federal government to hold this anyway because they needed to show that they were patriotic like other cities. And so they went ahead and held the parade. 200,000 people lined the streets, arm in arm, very, very close proximity to one another, obviously. And as a result of that, it spread even more rapidly in the days that followed that. In the 2 weeks that followed, thousands of people came down with serious influenza, and I've forgotten what the figure was, but enormously high number of people died there because of that.
yeah. I just learned about that just in the past 2 weeks, I guess. I have an article here from the U.S. Navy. It's titled, and I'll put links to all these things in the show notes. Philadelphia nurses and the Spanish influenza pandemic of 1918. The article focuses on the nursing crisis at the time. And just one other interesting detail is that some huge percentage of doctors and nurses from Philadelphia were serving in the war.
Mm-hmm.
That's part of the reason why this was such a big problem. But yeah, I have this one little clip here with an interesting thing about that exact subject. So it was the parade happened 10 days after the outbreak. A ship arrived.
Mm-hmm.
There's a Navy base still there, but it's not an active base. But it was even during my childhood and young adulthood, the Philadelphia Navy Yard was a big deal. A lot of people had jobs there, and it was there are still a lot of ships there, so it was a significant base. So anyway, it said this article says the disease appeared first at the sprawling naval base and shipyards on 18 September. The next day, 600 sailors were ill. This ship had come in from Boston, and there was an outbreak in Boston.
Right.
So that's how it got here. They were
Hmm.
probably already sick when they got on their ship because it can't take very long to get here from Boston.
Yes.
It says the next day, 600 sailors were ill. At the same time, civilian hospitals started receiving patients. The
Hmm.
Board of Health now began to act by instituting a public campaign against coughing, sneezing, and spitting. Philadelphia was about to become the American city with the highest, most rapidly accumulating death toll in the worst pandemic in recorded history. In a single day, the death toll reached 1,700.
Hmm.
Despite the crisis, on 28 September, 200,000 people gathered in the streets to view the kickoff of the Fourth Liberty Loan Drive. The parade stretched 23 blocks through the city, and death marched with it. And so it is commonly believed that, this is the thing that really, threw it into exponential growth. I don't know if any of my family was there or how, if this is a factor in my great grandmother's death, but I also looked for some things in the Philadelphia newspapers, and I did find this interesting one in something called the Philly Voice, and they talk about the nature of this parade. They say, but amid growing excitement that the war was nearing an end, 200,000 people flooded Center City. That's what people call downtown of
Hmm.
Philadelphia, Center City, loudly cheering as thousands of military personnel, industry workers, relief workers, scouts, and veterans marched down Broad Street. And they cite some other bits from like the Philadelphia Bulletin and I guess the Inquirer too. They were saying this is the greatest day for it was a very braggadocious type thing too,
Hmm.
and they were celebrating an early victory. Really, I guess the armistice was only
2 months
two
away.
months, yeah,
Yeah.
2 months away.
Yeah.
So the other thing, I think this parade was definitely a part of it, but there was more to it than that. The Let me see if I have another clip here, but basically Philadelphia was there were people coming in by train and by every imaginable method of transportation because this was you know this was one of the great centers of the military industrial complex,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
So you had people coming in. It's a very busy city and lots of people coming in and out from places domestic and abroad. So that had to play a big role too. And when it actually came, the pandemic, we sent it over to Europe, and then it morphed and it changed, and another form of it came back, and we got different waves. So yeah, it's complicated, but yeah, your main point that it was all centered around this war is just it's spot on. It's very true. And I like how you're trying to use that lesson and draw the parallels between today. So let's talk about your article, and you say you call it a deeply ingrained Pentagon habit of protecting its parochial military interests at the expense of the health of American troops. And apparently, 100 years later, we still have the same, so deeply ingrained. It was a key issue 100 years ago as well.
Yeah. I think it's really a striking parallel between the 1918 pandemic and today's pandemic in this regard, because uh, even though the nature of the U.S. military has changed fundamentally in a way from what it was in 1918. That is to say, today it's a volunteer force, whereas in 1918, of course, it was a force that it relied heavily on the draft, and it was, in that sense, more directly connected with the population. And one of the things that you read about in regard to what has happened in the last uh, 40 years now since the draft ended is the growing uh, space, the degree to which the military elite and the military organization have been distanced from the majority of the population of the United States, and that certainly is the case. That there's a that there's a no longer a direct connection between most Americans, most American families, and the U.S. military. Uh, Certainly compared with the situation in World War I or World War II. And yet, I think you still see, as you've just mentioned, the same pattern between these two periods of 1918 and 2020, that the Pentagon or the military leadership are insensitive to the welfare of their own sailors and troops, their Army and Navy personnel, particularly. And so one has to ask a question here: why is this? What is the nature of this beast that causes a military, both during a world war, which was a stupid war to begin with, and that never should have been fought, and the United States did not need to intervene in World War I, should not have intervened in World War I, and through hundreds of thousands, 1.5 million to 2.5 million troops into that war needlessly, on one hand, and this present military, which is involved in needless interventions and long wars, or at least has been over the last 20 years. On the other hand, there is nevertheless this common characteristic that the military elite, and I must say the civilian elite that makes up the leadership of the war state, are still really uncaring in the end about the troops and the people who have to carry the main burden in any military conflict. So why is this? And I think that that this goes to the heart of the beast itself. That is the heart of the war system, which is that there's an interest on the part of the elite, political and military elite on one hand, and an interest of the rank and file people who must suffer the consequences on the other, and that the elite inevitably, unless they are forced to come to terms with the system and forced to stand down, are going to serve their own interests, which are going to be at odds with the interests of the rank and file people who must pay the price. So I think that's the common origin of these two situations that makes for this parallel between the two that we now see once again in 2020 with the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, spreading across the United States and through the military as well, on a smaller scale, but nevertheless a significant degree. We see that the Pentagon and the service chiefs are once again exhibiting this habit of mind of putting their own interests above the interests of their sailors and soldiers. And this is expressed in a variety of ways. But I think the primary thing is that they are continuing to talk as though our problem is fundamentally to keep the mission intact, to make sure that we're ready for war at all times, at every moment, and the soldiers and sailors must adjust to this, and implicitly they must pay a price of risk to their own health. So this plays out in a variety of ways, but I think this is the common frame that we see at work in all of these issues that have arisen over the past few weeks.
Right. And so we have the situation with the Theodore Roosevelt is one of our aircraft carriers. It's in, I don't know if it was in the South China Sea, but it's out in the Pacific,
Right.
and it's in Guam right now. And so we had a captain. I think everybody has heard this story. I assume he reached up to his chain of command and said, "Hey, look, we have sick people on board. We need to do something about this." Uh, I guess the story is that he was not satisfied with the reaction or the response from his chain of command, and therefore he wrote something like a 5-page memo, and he copied like 20 or 30 people, some of whom were, I guess it was out of protocol to send it to people lower than him. He was only supposed to talk to his bosses, and it leaked out. We don't know how, but it leaked out, and then it caused a, a big problem. And I did hear the first press conference of, what is his name, Modley?
Oh, yeah, totally.
Yeah. And his first press conference was very annoyed, and he was like, I don't know what that guy's doing. And, he claimed that they had already put into place, or where they were in the process of putting into place the things that Captain Crozier wanted. And am I saying that right? Crozier?
Crozier, yes.
Yeah. That he had these things were already in process, and he didn't need to raise the alarm bell and leak this out. And so he was extremely angry at that point. And that day or the next day, in Trump is holding daily briefings for people who don't know. They're around dinner time, and they're getting a lot of play. There's been a lot of controversy about them, but Trump's knee-jerk reaction was to support his acting Navy secretary. And so he was mad at the captain, and he was all on board. And I guess then Crozier was removed. Trump claims it wasn't his decision, but he's the commander in chief, so it is his decision. And then all hell broke loose. We got videos of sailors during the command change ceremony. As soon as they were allowed to be at ease, they started cheering for the outgoing captain who was just fired. And presumably his career was on the verge of being ruined at that point. He wasn't going to get any more promotions, that's for sure. And they were cheering for the captain. It was very clear whose side at least a lot of sailors were on. I guess the next day after that, Trump still some kind of doubles down, says I fully support my secretary and the upper brass. But then he reversed himself later when he, I guess, saw the public reaction, or he claims that he looked further. He didn't know Crozier, and he looked further into his record, and now he's reconsidering that probably wasn't a good idea. And
Right.
then the
Right.
Navy secretary resigned, and Crozier he's been transferred to a different position where he's in charge of maybe the COVID response or something for the Navy. He's involved in that. But whether or not his standing in the Navy and his career will be saved over this, it looks like maybe it will. But that's kind of how that played out.
Well, there's some extraordinary features of this whole series of events that really deserve to be understood and mentioned and understood, beginning with the fact that clearly there's much more to the story than has been revealed by the Navy itself thus far, because there were clearly there was indications that Captain Crozier had tried to do something to get the ball moving, to have something happen very rapidly, and apparently his commanding officer, who was on the ship with him, had not done anything or had not done enough, and that's why he went over his head directly, to the higher ups to demand some action, and that was when he began to get into trouble. Now we don't know fully the story behind this, but something had failed to happen that he wanted to happen, about getting his sailors to safety who were clearly beginning to fall to the pandemic there on the ship. And so
Right.
he felt that he had to do something more dramatic. And the second thing is that there should have been an investigation before he was fired. There's no question about that.
Yeah.
The Navy itself understood that and was interested in trying to have an investigation before Modley did something dramatic, such as firing Crozier. Um, and so Modley was acting against the judgment of some of the people in the Navy brass themselves, who believed that there should be an investigation. And he did that apparently in the belief that the White House was on his side. White House was interested in doing something more dramatic. So the idea appears to be, that Modley was acting in a way that he felt would be acceptable and approved by President Trump himself.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a key factor in his decision making. And then you have this remarkable situation where Modley flies to
Oh, yeah.
Guam and then goes on the ship and reams out the sailors themselves. He attacks the sailors themselves. I mean, it's an unbelievable situation where the acting Secretary of the Navy is attacking thousands of sailors who are assembled on the deck of the ship, all supporting their captain, who they cheered when he had to leave the ship, and Modley is attacking them for doing this, and so that there's such an unseemly situation that Modley's fate was then sealed. I mean, there's no question that he had to go after that. And so this is just such a dramatic finale to this series of moves that it underlines, so clearly the separation between the interests of the rank and file sailors on one hand, and these bureaucrats who really are not in touch with them or do not care about them on the other.
Well, it's clear they cared more about the political situation at hand,
Right.
that, which is just despicable, really.
It is despicable, and I think it has two parts to it. One of them is what we've just been talking about, is sort of the political side to this, worrying about what the president thinks as the primary thing, and whatever they think the president wants, then Modley and some other bureaucrats are ready to go along with it. And by the way, I saw the video of the press conference of a couple of days ago of the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and another higher up in the Pentagon addressing a broad range of issues connected with the coronavirus. And it was very striking that they did nothing to criticize Modley. They were very much sort of leaning in the direction of saying, well, what he did was okay. And that clearly was because they were afraid of the wrath of President Trump. So, the entire upper level, the highest level of the Pentagon are now, sort of in this crouching position, defending essentially what Modley did, or at least not willing to come out against it.
Yeah.
That's another remarkable feature of this whole imbroglio.
Yeah. I mean, a couple of things come to mind. One is that the Navy, of all of the services, should have they have experience with this kind of thing. This is not unprecedented, but just to play devil's advocate a little bit here, I'll give them just a little benefit of the doubt, maybe. Their mindset probably is like, oh my God, I'm going to, well, as Danny Sherson said, embarrassing the Navy or the Army or the Marines or any of them, that's the biggest crime. The biggest crime you could commit
Of
as a person serving in any of the military branches is to embarrass it. So I think that there was some widespread, you know, that was violated, and I'm sure there were a lot of people, regardless of the commander in chief, who's just going to be he's just going to support the top brass pretty much, no matter what they do. At least that's his history. But
Well,
the
in this
other,
case, I think it was the reverse, though. I think it was more the brass in the Navy really fearing the wrath of the president and wanting to be on the right side of it more than the opposite. At least
okay,
my reading of it, based on what I've seen and read. Yeah.
okay, yeah, maybe I'm just approaching this because I've just seen him over. He'll just praise and praise the military; they can do no wrong. Yeah, I hadn't looked
But
at it from
but you're
that
right
perspective.
that the idea of not being embarrassed is the upper the biggest concern of the military elite. Absolutely, you're right about that, and the problem is that they should have been embarrassed. They need to be embarrassed in this situation.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like it started with one, presumably an admiral of some level, not doing the right thing, and that being Crozier's only path toward getting anything done
Right.
through, the top down thing. And when that didn't happen, yeah. So, but the other thing is, and here's where it gets to the broader issue of uh, just the military interests. So I saw many references to this, and I think it makes sense. The other thing they were worried about is um, giving off, they didn't want to give off information about which aircraft carriers were vulnerable, which of them were sort of crippled by this. And they wanted that to remain secret for security reasons. It became, an immense vulnerability for them. And so they wanted to handle it quietly. I'm
No,
not
you're
saying they
absolutely
did
right.
handle it well. I'm
You're
just
right.
saying that that had to be, I mean, these guys are trained to think this way every minute of the day as to, not showing weakness, not showing vulnerability.
You are correct.
This
You are
global
correct.
pandemic is just, you can already see people exploiting this pandemic in 100 different ways from all different parts of this country and the world. So I do think that that was a factor as well. And I certainly wouldn't have wanted to be in their position, that's for sure. But
But
navies,
this takes us back to the fundamental issue that I think we started with, which was the parallel between
yes.
way the army brass, the General Pershing in France, the commander of the U.S. forces in World War One, and the Army Chief of Staff, who was the one who was organizing the logistics to support Pershing, and by sending him, a wave after wave of hundreds of thousands of replacements and new troops to form new divisions to give him more to throw into the fight. And then the present day situation where you have a military uh, organization whose overwhelming concern is to project themselves as the strongest power in the world, and to continue to talk about how we are prepared for war at every moment. They're still doing that in the press conference that I was just watching from 2 days ago. They're using this rhetoric about that we're prepared for war at this moment, and if the United States had to go to war today, it wouldn't matter whether the Theodore Roosevelt was had to be taken out of commission for a while or not. Well, that's right. It's true. We could go to war. The question is whether it would be necessary to go to war. And of course, the answer to that is very clear. There is no necessity to go to war. There's nobody in the world who is interested in going to war with the United States to do what they're talking about. It's really an interest that is peculiar to the military bureaucracy, It's what they're concerned about because that's how they get all of their power and all of the public resources that they need to get from the U.S. Congress and the American people. And so it's natural for them to make that the center of their attention, that's all important to them. But to the American people, no, it's not important. And
Yeah,
that's really the underlying theme that I think has to be brought out.
yeah, and especially now, like if we just do this comparison of 1918 to now, um, you have a really good paragraph laying out some of the things you just talked about, the different players, the chief of staff and the surgeon general and so on. And they said that, um, you say, asked why he refused to stop troop transport during the epidemic, March argued that Germany would be encouraged to fight on if it knew, quote, the American divisions and replacements were no longer arriving. Wilson then approved his decision, refusing to disturb Pershing's war plans. So at this point in time, the end of the war was imminent, and this seems like a legitimate reason, sort of. They didn't want to show any weakness, which would encourage, Germany to counterattack or to regroup and keep the war going. So they're trying to end the war. They're trying to win the war. So at least then they're trying to end a war. Now, what? Tell me again why the reason is that the Theodore Roosevelt can't dock in Guam or somewhere else and take troops off and take care of the situation properly. Tell me what the urgent war need is to what is it, Gareth? Because I'm
Right.
not
I mean,
seeing it.
the answer, of course, is that there is no urgent need. And if you examine this press conference that was held 2 days ago with the vice chief of staff, uh, vice chairman, excuse me, vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Hyten of the Air Force, as the primary figure in that press conference, the whole theme of that was that we are prepared to go to war at any moment, and it doesn't matter what this epidemic does in terms of the number of soldiers or sailors who might get sick. So in effect, they undercut their own argument for the behavior that was carried out or that we've seen in regard to the Theodore Roosevelt. There's no excuse for that because it really doesn't matter. And they actually make the argument because that's what they do. They say we're ready regardless of what happens. We have so much power that we can take care of it regardless of whether a one or two warships or aircraft carriers has to be taken temporarily out of commission, which is what's going on. There's no logic whatsoever to the argument that was being made at the time for taking a hard line, about Crozier and so forth. There's no military logic to it, and in the larger sense, this is simply an emanation of the deception that is being constantly played against the American public, that the United States must be prepared for war at any moment. It's wrong at two levels. At the level of, even if there was somebody who was thinking like China or Russia was secretly planning a war against the United States, it wouldn't matter because the United States has the ability to respond militarily regardless of what happens to a specific ship or set of ships. And we can retaliate, and that would cause them to back off. I mean, the ability to retaliate would be enough in itself. So at so many levels, this is utterly wrong and deceptive, just as it was in World War I. We now know, and we should have known at the time, that the German high command, was ready to surrender. They had demanded of the German chancellor that he end the war because it wasn't sustainable. They couldn't continue it. So in the end, all of that sacrifice that was being made by hundreds of thousands of American troops of becoming ill and dying of the influenza pandemic of 1918 was unnecessary because the Germans were ready to surrender in 1918. Again, bear in mind, as you mentioned, that really it was not until September of of 2018 of 1918, excuse me, that the U.S. military was beginning to send troops uh, into the battle, despite the fact that there was a pandemic going on. It was September 1918, and it was by that time that the Germans were already ready to surrender. All they had to do was to sit down with the Germans and talk peace, and they weren't doing it. That's the bottom line.
And the same can be said of now. It's a perfect opportunity. I mean, this is the way my mind works anyway, but as soon as I saw how this was playing out, I thought this is bring them home, get them
Sure.
out of there, especially
Yeah.
Iraq. I mean, get them out of there. Um, yeah, and just the domestic impact. Now, it hasn't happened with this pandemic. I hope it doesn't. Where, like in this case, in 1918, 75% of Philadelphia's hospitals, medical and surgical staffs were overseas
Yeah.
at the time,
Right.
right? So
Right.
that actually put us in it put the homeland, if you will, in greater danger. And
Absolutely. That's an astonishing fact that you've just offered people.
yeah,
Yeah.
that link will be in there. It's from the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, and it's about the great nursing crisis that they had too. But and it I mean, just as a broader point, uh, it's much more complicated now and less justified. At that point in time, we had, troops on a battlefield and such. I'm not saying their decision was good, but I'm just comparing it to today. Today, what we have is pursuit of empire. And first of all, it's clear that empires and pandemics are not compatible. Pandemics aren't compatible with anything, but uh, you know, at this point in time, we're not technically in the middle of a hot war, except you could say Afghanistan. They still have to protect themselves a lot, but even there, we're in talks with the Taliban. This is a manageable, it seems to me, situation
Well,
where
Joanne, the bottom line here is that there is no war that needs to be or that should be continued at all, and that the American people understand that and want those wars to end. It's an overwhelming majority that support ending the Afghan war. They want troops home from Iraq very clearly, and so this is a situation where it's time to bring all U.S. troops home from abroad. There's a movement which you may be aware of by an organization calling for the return home of 30,000 National Guardsmen who are now abroad, fighting in wars or other actions that are unnecessary. And so this is a moment when this coronavirus pandemic gives us an even greater reason for bringing all troops home and having really an end to this extraordinary and unnecessary period of U.S. Troops being sent abroad for reasons which we now understand much more clearly than ever before were unnecessary and really need to be brought to an end.
that's a good point. And then these are dark days, so let me try to end it on a maybe positive note. Let me just ask you this question. This incident with the Theodore Roosevelt, I'm sure it's not the only case
That's right.
inside of our vast military where we've got, problems and difficulties on making decisions where we know that we have people who are positive for this virus on, I think, 4 carriers, last I heard. And, we've got army bases all over the world. The situation, first of all, the pandemic itself, and the situation with the Roosevelt. Do you think that that's going to cause the military brass, the policy people, to stop and think and possibly change course in any way as a result of it? Will they reflect on it? Do they have time to stand back and reflect on it? Do you think it'll have any impact going forward?
The answer is clearly no. It will not cause them to reflect or to change anything fundamentally. But what I do believe is now very possible is that the series of incidents, particularly the Theodore Roosevelt incident, will generate a movement among the families of U.S. sailors and perhaps U.S. Army troops as well, to oppose more broadly the policy of the Trump administration and of the military to downgrade so clearly the interests of American service people and to demand a change in the way this is being handled more generally. And that this movement could be the basis now for a broader crisis within the military-industrial congressional complex, because it comes in the wake of a series of situations in which the U.S., obviously because of the crisis, the coronavirus crisis, the U.S. economy is in huge crisis. And that means that the military budget itself is going to be in crisis. And so all of these crises, I think, are coming together in a way that makes it possible to put much more political pressure on the military-industrial congressional complex to reduce the military budget for a variety of reasons. I think this is a hopeful possibility, and we'll see how it plays out.
Yeah, and if we can't get the budget down, one thing I've always thought about is, well, can't we repurpose some of the military industrial complex production facilities and engineering facilities to do some things and build some things that are needed at home? Like,
absolutely, this is something that needs to be discussed, particularly to support America's ability to resist a pandemic. I mean, this is clearly, a huge weakness of this country. It should have been done. I've written about that as well, as you may know, about the failure of the beginning with the Obama administration, but also, of course, the Trump administration, the failure to be prepared to cope with this pandemic, even though there were plenty of warnings ahead of time to do so. So this is part of what needs to happen, is to divert billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars, to the readiness for this kind of pandemic in the future, because it will happen again.
Totally.
But there are other things, as you've indicated, that we need to be to divert huge amounts of money from the defense budget to other forms of preparedness for the American people.
Yeah, and he's got the vehicle to do it now with the Defense Production Act, though it's kind of flipped on its side, but it certainly could be used for that. And also, I just wanted to mention that I've mentioned this poll before. In recent months, there was a poll of I don't think it was active duty. I think it was all veterans. And somewhere around 70% of them said that both the Iraq War and the Afghan War were not worth fighting.
Right.
And the public, the percentage among the non-military public were similar. So the conditions are ripe for exactly what you are talking about. And let's just keep doing our little part to bring that about, because
yes, let's follow the lead of people in the military and their families. I think that's really a very, very important watchword at this moment.
Excellent. Gareth, tell everybody where they can find you and how they can support your work.
Well, I can, I think, announce at this moment that I'm going to be contributing primarily at this point, if not exclusively, to the Gray Zone, on
Wow,
the
excellent.
Roosevelt site, and I will be a regular contributor to them in the coming year. That's something that I've been discussing, and we have made a decision to collaborate.
Excellent. Those guys are doing great work, and so are you. And I'll put all of your Twitter handle and all of that stuff in the show notes. And thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And take good care.
Thank you for your interest in my work, Joanne. I appreciate it a lot. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you for listening. Special thanks to Gareth Porter. Follow Gareth on Twitter at Gareth Porter. Find his work at The American Conservative, antiwar.com, Middle East Eye, and other media outlets. And he's also now at The Gray Zone. Read his new book, The CIA Insider's Guide to the Iran Crisis, From CIA Coup to the Brink of War. Around the Empire podcast, independent media. Your support's really important. Pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. You can find this podcast and listen to it in a lot of different ways, any mobile podcast app, or on the website, aroundtheempire.com, at Patreon, or on YouTube. And if you're listening on YouTube, hit the like, share, and subscribe. Also follow on Twitter at Around the Empire. And we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.